Good afternoon to you. Mark Sutton with HurricaneTrack.com here. Time for our Hurricane Outlook and discussion. It's Monday, October 17th, 2022, and today pretty much going to present my thoughts about what we can expect for the rest of the season ahead. 2022 has been very strange, very unusual. I feel like we've kind of compressed things into a 2 or 3 week time frame here with the most of the hurricane activity occurring at that point in time. And so where do we go from here? We'll take a look at some climatology and kind of try to make sense of things as we go through the next 6 weeks or so. Remember, hurricane season officially gets done. It wraps up on November 30th, so there is still time on the clock. This background graphic there, part of today's thumbnail, kind of illustrating that. That's a climatological representation of things. We'll look at that as we go forward. All right, let's get on with it, shall we? First, real quick stop at the National Hurricane Center homepage. That's a good reference point. Nothing in the Atlantic over the next several days, but the Eastern Pacific, of course. Looks like something's going to try to develop there. 70% over the next 5 days. If we expand this out, look at that high probability of development. And folks along this part of Mexico here are going to really need to watch this. I will explain why in just a moment. It's been really unusual, at least compared to what we thought was going to happen, how busy the Eastern Pacific has been. But it's not really unusual in terms of climatology. And let me explain here, pulling up some stats. Stats are always good. Colorado State University, this is the North Atlantic. We'll look at that first. We can highlight some things here to help you out. We've had 11 named storms. Normally, we would have 12.4 going back and looking at history, all right, over the last 30 years or so. That's the background that Dr. Klotzbach is using and comparing this to. So we're a little bit below average for the North Atlantic on named storms. We've had 47 named storm days. That's down from 60. We've had 5 hurricanes. Normally we have 6. We've had 19 hurricane days. That's a little less than the 23. And we've had 2 major hurricanes. You can just round this up and call it 3. So we're about 1 below where we should be. We've had 5 major hurricane days. We're about 1 day shy of normal. And the ACE, this is an important metric right here, we are at about 84. And the normal for an entire season is about 107 for this climatological period here. And there's different people that have different data sets that they use for their background. But over the last 30 years, on this particular update here from Dr. Klotzbach and his real-time tracking, the Atlantic Basin coming in just a smidge below the long-term average here, which is, of course, way below where we thought we would be based on especially May, June, July, and even August forecasts from the major climate models. The ECMWF was very bullish. Remember back in June, I sure do, it was predicting an ACE of 225, and it kept showing well above normal activity every couple of weeks, what we call the weeklies, and that really didn't happen. Now, I don't want to turn this into an hour-long, what went wrong kind of thing. Maybe we can do that later at some point, maybe get Dr. Klotzbach to come on. We could do a special edition of our Hurricane U series to do that. But we have definitely fallen short of the expectations from both the forecasting agencies, which are made up of people, and the model guidance that they use to make up the forecasts. All right, so just kind of pointing that out there, keeping it real, as they say. What about the Eastern Pacific here, where things have been so busy since July, really? Well, we're about where we should be. A little bit ahead in the named storms department. We've had 73 named storms days. That's up. We've had 9 hurricanes. That's up from where we should be, right about where we should be. Just a slight, 1 day behind hurricane days. 1 short of the major hurricanes expected. So we've had a lot of just garden variety hurricanes, just not too many intense hurricanes. You can also call major hurricanes intense hurricanes. So 3 versus 4 over climatology. 3 major hurricane days, that's significantly down, honestly. And then the ACE in the Pacific. And that's why this metric is so important. While the East Pac has been very busy, the ACE score tells us that, we haven't had that many long-lived, intense hurricanes in the Pacific. And the rest of the statistics here back that up. So it's been busier in the Pacific than we thought it would be. because the Pacific was forecast to be below average, the Atlantic was forecast to be way above average, and they kind of switched positions, at least in the way the forecast was supposed to be. But just showing you, the East Pac is right where it should be for the most part. The Atlantic Basin, again, coming in just a little bit below the long-term average. So what's happening out there today? We'll look at this real quick before we move on. A lot of westerly winds here, that's for sure, as this big trough carves out with northwesterly flow here. Coldest air of the early fall season draining in to the lower 48 now. Going to be very chilly here across the southeast over the next several days. And then it'll warm up again. The pattern's going to flip. But what about the tropics? Well, nice and clear through the Caribbean, including the eastern, of course, the western Caribbean, southwest Atlantic, nice. Again, there's westerlies kind of screaming across the northern Gulf Coast here. No areas of disturbed weather to even worry about at all. Huge upper level low in the mid-levels, upper levels of the atmosphere out in the northeast Atlantic near the Azores. Some disturbed weather out here in the eastern Atlantic, but again, you can even see westerly winds prevail all through this area. You don't even need to look at streamline maps or anything like that. You can just tell strong winds are blowing against any systems that might be trying to come off to the west here. They are being opposed by strong upper level winds. All right, so where should we be climatologically speaking this time of year? Well, October, the densest area of activity is usually in the northwest Caribbean, and yes, it tends to curve up towards Florida. This is over the 100-year time frame. But that doesn't say that's what's going to happen this October, because it's made up of a long time, 100 years, right? But in that time frame, the sort of densest area, as you can see, is, if you look at this as a gradient, I guess, a very small gradient, because there's not a lot of colors and there's not a lot of overall data. But again, the green, you get 20 to 34 hurricanes per 100 years. Yes, that tracks up across western Cuba in a fashion very similar to what we had with Ian. Now, Ian only missed the October window by a couple of days, right? Just a few days there. So it almost fit that pattern. It came across, as you all certainly recall, let's use white. That'll stick out. Started off down here, made its way across, developed, came across, and you know the rest. All right, so that fits the pattern of what we'd expect late September into October. And then for whatever reason, over the 100 years, there's a small area there where it gets a little bit higher, 35 to 49 hurricanes over 100 years. I guess you can get activity that's curving up coming out of the Caribbean, and that just seems to be some kind of an intersection out there. Just funny how that works. But climatologically speaking, it's typically the blue areas here with the lesser amounts, and then again the greater amount of activity focused over western Cuba and South Florida. But what about this year? Well, we'll get to that. You know, is there a risk of another landfall in Florida this year? First of all, let's also, just for the heck of it, look at November. Obviously, activity really starts to calm down. It is still focused here in the western Caribbean for the most part, the southwest to western Atlantic, and then a few oddball areas scattered out here in the open subtropical Atlantic, where you can get some little areas of energy that dip down out of the westerlies. They pinch off, they kind of go backward and retrograde, and then they develop over the warmer waters. You get instability that's really high out across that area due to very cold air in the upper levels of the atmosphere out here. These are more your typical tropical areas that can develop even in November. And just to remind you, as an example here, 2001 we had Hurricane Michelle. That came up out of the western Caribbean, almost fitting that pattern there perfectly. Hurricane Michelle did, cutting across the Bahamas, something like that. That's a rough track of it. And then, you know, there's years like 1999 where you had Wrong Way Lenny that went across from west to east, similar to that across the Caribbean. And there are other examples of November hurricanes as well, but November typically things start to really calm down, and I don't see that that will change too much this year. Now, let's look at it from a different perspective. What about the real tracks of past events? Well, we are right here in the middle of October, so we're going to click on 11th through the 20th, and this goes back to 1851 through last year. We really appreciate Howard, one of our supporters from Bermuda, to put this together for us. And you can clearly see, yes, we do have a hurricane problem still, with quite the cluster here in the western Caribbean. somewhat of a cluster, if I can talk, in the southwest Atlantic during this 10-day time frame. And then you can see the various and sundry tracks. Generally speaking, it fits that climatological pattern that I was showing you, where a lot of them do go across South Florida. They're in the Western Caribbean. They cut across Western Cuba. But then there are plenty that are out here over the open Atlantic, the subtropical Atlantic. There's a lot of traffic out here east of the United States. So what about the last third of the month? We can turn this off and go to the 21st through the 31st. You get less activity overall, but it is still there, generally concentrated, again, in the Western Caribbean over here, some in the Southwest Atlantic, a few areas in the Gulf of Mexico, sure, but again, the overall signal starts to die off. And notice, too, don't want to neglect the Eastern Pacific. It kind of stays busy even through the end of the month as well. And then just looking ahead to all of November, we'll just add it all up, all 3/3, right? 3/3 makes a whole. There you go, November. Look at that, how it's typically shaped from southwest to northeast. There you go. Why? Typically, I've said that word a lot. We usually see a lot of troughiness over the east. Your mean trough is going to be like that, roughly, I would assume. And so your westerlies and your southwesterly flow are going to scoop these cyclones up and generally move them away from the United States. But then that says nothing about our good friends down here in Cuba and Hispaniola, Puerto Rico maybe. They're not, some of these tracks do go over those islands, the Greater Antilles, the Bahamas, certainly, but there are a few that do run up the East Coast. Right here as North Carolina got impacted, even up into New England one of those years. And so yeah, we have to watch. It's not over yet, but it is looking better both from a climatological perspective, the overall background state, and as I'm going to show you, the reality. What are things looking like? And this is where I would insert my thoughts to this. We've got our background, but what about going forward? Well, this is a big help. How is the sea surface temperature situation shaping up right now? We still have fairly warm relative to average water temperatures in the deep tropics. We've got our La Nina going strong here in the Pacific, and then this very large area of way above normal water temperatures in the far North Atlantic. You got to have some people working on that, I'm sure. Like, how is that throwing things out of balance? I'm sure it has to have some impact. A very similar situation, almost like a mirror image, in the North Pacific as well, the Northwest Pacific, well above normal water temperatures. So there's a lot of interesting things going on with sea surface temperatures that suggest a busy October and November, but that's not the same as actually having a busy October or November. Some of these parameters could be favorable, but that alone, water temperatures alone, are not going to give us above average activity or anything like that. Zooming in a little bit, yes, the main development region, warmer than average, the Caribbean and Gulf as well. But then there's all this very warm water up in the subtropics. So I would venture to guess that we could get some disturbances still coming off Africa every once in a while, and they're going to wind up here in the subtropics and try to develop more up there rather than over here. That's not to say we can't have development in the Western Caribbean or the Gulf or Southwest Atlantic. I don't know that. But I would put more of my money, so to speak, if I was a betting man, over here versus over here. I'm not going to exit, but I would put, that little emoji where the guy is like, I don't know. That's what I'd put over there. We're getting, look, this front that's getting ready to come through is going to be a doozy. 38 here tomorrow night in the Wilmington, North Carolina area. We're cooling off the water temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico. It's just going to be harder. So I would think that more than likely we'd get any kind of hurricane development to happen in the subtropics. That's just the way things look now. Now watch, there'll be 2 hurricanes in the Western Caribbean and the Gulf, and just go against all that. That's the way 2022 has been. But to my point, the gradient here, the difference in temperature over distance, this is your area where it's warm enough to support hurricanes all through here, 26 Celsius, something like that. Everything up against the shelf water area, the coast, has cooled off. So you'd have to have a fast-moving hurricane coming up out of the tropics, cutting across eastern North Carolina, or something that kind of did like Ian, maybe get one coming up and then high pressure builds up over the north and blocks it, and sends it into the low country of South Carolina. But they're going to have to be moving fast to really keep their punch for wind and low pressure. But you can still get a lot of rain. You can still get a big storm surge from even a dying hurricane. Absolutely. So we're not out of the woods yet. We're getting there. It might not be warm enough right at the coast, but just offshore it certainly is. So again, we can't write it off. I mean, look, Sandy, 10 years ago, the end of October, and look what it did. You can get these systems that can pack quite a punch. What about the Gulf? Up here, 26 Celsius line has retreated pretty much like that overall. So most of the northern Gulf Coast is safe from intense hurricanes making landfall at peak intensity. But, and let me come back on because I want to make this very clear, that is not to say you can't have a hurricane making landfall with significant impacts. You're just going to have a lot harder time, if not almost meteorologically impossible, to get one to come up in those areas that I just outlined above that black line that I drew at peak intensity. I mean, it would have to be moving really fast, and if it's moving that fast, it's probably sheared. So, and we're talking wind and low pressure for that part of the intensity. You could still get, just as an example, a hurricane coming up out of the Caribbean into Mississippi, Alabama, Mobile Bay, whatever, and you could shove a lot of water in there. Same thing for the Florida Panhandle, Texas, wherever. You're not completely safe, but I mean, just logic would tell you, and looking out the window, so to speak, at what's going on out there, things are looking better. Now, we got to be real. Southwest Florida still could get something intense if it existed in the first place. I want to make it very clear. We don't have anything at all that suggests that that will happen. But water temperatures over here, still 27, 28 Celsius, right up against the coastline. And yes, if we had something that rounded the corner and headed into that direction over the next few days, because this is going to keep coming down, these water temperatures, those water temperatures will. We got about a week left, and then it's going to be much harder for something to get up into that area as well. So we're close. We're close here. Again, trying to paint you some pretty good news in the scheme of things here, especially since we've dealt with so much with Ian and in the wake of Ian. So now transitioning over to what's happening out there currently. Look at this. A lot of the energy in the atmosphere now, these vorticity areas, where are they? They're in the high latitudes. They're much higher in the northern latitudes. Still some impulses down in the tropics, yes, but there's not as many. And they are stretched out. They're moving slower, especially in the Atlantic. They seem to have been moving slow all season. So there's just not a lot of energy down in the tropics to develop into anything. Rarely do hurricanes just form out of nothing. Sometimes you get an area of vorticity or spin in the atmosphere that will come seemingly out of nowhere, but it doesn't happen like that. Okay, it's not like the Hollywood movies or whatever. It happened without warning. That's not true. We can see it happening, and it's a fairly slow process. But these impulses that we have, they're not going to really do the trick, except possibly here in the Eastern Pacific. This could wrap up. I'll show you that in just a moment here on the modeling. Another clue is the Madden-Julian oscillation. Widespread, large-scale upward motion. How's that looking? Not favorable for the Western Hemisphere region. It got crazy on me there. There we go. Let's try it that way. Not favorable. Not in phases 8, 1, or 2. Where is it? It's stuck, literally stuck in the Western Pacific. Look at this, the ECMWF, MJO for the next couple of weeks. It's pretty much just going to sit here like a squashed gigantic spider or family of spiders, as it were. That's terrible, isn't it? But yeah, the MJO not going to assist the Atlantic over the next couple of weeks. The JMA, Japanese Meteorological Agency, agrees with that scenario. Madden-Julian oscillation in the Westpac. And again, that won't help the Atlantic Basin. And we can see that reflected in reality here in the modeling. In a rare instance, I'm going to show you the next 384 hours, and we'll paint out a couple things for you here. Here's that trough that's digging in across the eastern, almost eastern half of the country, roughly. There's a little bit of an impulse there down in the tropics, and then another big trough of low pressure up here. Now, this is down at around 5,000 feet in the atmosphere, the 850 millibar level. But it looks pretty much the same, just to show you, up at 500 millibars right there. There's that trough You can see carved out here, another trough of low pressure there, little impulse there. That's what it looks like on the 500 millibar and the surface. This will go back to 850 though. It makes it easier to spot these little impulses. Do we see any? Drag this out across the next few days. You see one there in the East Pack, yes. We're out to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 days and beyond. And there's one of those little pieces right there that I talked about in the subtropics. We'll have to watch that for maritime interests, marine interest, shipping. It doesn't do much. Some energy tries to come off some of these fronts off the Carolinas, the mid-Atlantic. Those are the things we're going to have to watch for going out into time, these mid-latitude storms. But nothing to really hang your hat on over the next 2 weeks. And again, the GFS way out in time here. This is November 2nd, the day before my birthday. How about that? Already there. Now, that's a good pattern if you like warm weather in the east. Florida would be nice and warm, get you guys to dry out more. Good pattern for that. Maybe a little bit of a hint of lowering of pressures. There's an impulse there. But look, way, way, way out in time, 384 hours. You know how it goes. That's so far out. Anything could just be completely different. But it's interesting. It's got a big old ridge sitting across a good deal of the Atlantic there. So if something were to come along, we'd have to really watch it. The pattern might be there in 2 weeks. We'll just have to see if the weather, the reality, is there as well. And that's what we do. We look for these things to see what might develop, and then we go from there. All right? So a couple of just brand, housekeeping things, whatever. YouTube has enabled it so that people like me can have a handle. So it used to just be youtube.com/hurricane track. Everything we do is hurricane track. We were very lucky in the early years of social media to get all those, whatever you want to call it, like those handles, or everything is at hurricane track or /hurricane track. Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, it's all hurricane track. But recently, YouTube's made it very similar to Twitter, that it's just at hurricane track here on YouTube, just like you see on Twitter. I think that'll help our YouTube channel grow. So if you're sharing or you're telling people about our channel and what we're doing here, you can just tell them, you just search at hurricane track. I think a lot of people are used to that. You don't have to do the whole youtube.com/hurricane track. You can just go to YouTube and in the search bar, at hurricane track, the little at symbol, hurricane track. You got me? Good. So that's how you do it. So do me a favor, like, share, spread, get everybody, jump on here. Let's keep growing this. We've had a heck of a season. And we'll talk about that as we wrap things up and where we're going to go from here for the winter and the next hurricane season. But we still got 6 weeks left. We're not quite there yet, but I did want to tell you about that change that YouTube made. I think it'll be good. All right? All right, that's it from me for today, and probably for the rest of the week. I'm going to be doing some traveling this week, some business stuff, and there's not much happening. If something pops up, I'll certainly tell you about it. We got to watch that system in the East Pack, so yeah, maybe Wednesday or Thursday jump on and at least acknowledge what's going on out there in the Eastern Pacific. That's probably a good idea. All right, mental note. All right, I'm out. You guys have a great rest of your Monday. Thanks as always for tuning in. I am Mark Sudduth for At Hurricane Track. I'll be back with you later in the week.